Hello, everyone, and welcome to MOS Live. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are she and her, and I'll be your moderator today for this Ask a Scientist panel about amphibians. If you are joining us on Facebook, thank you so much for being there, but we cannot field your comments and questions from there right now. If you're watching us on Zoom, you can press the Q&A button to ask any questions that you may have about amphibians. If you would like a shout out, if we end up asking your question, please leave your name and age. If you'd like to see closed captions, you can press the CC button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Captions. So now I would like my scientists to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric. My pronouns are he, him. And my favorite amphibian from New England is the mud puppy. It's our largest one. It can grow about 15 inches long. It's found in the Connecticut River that goes between New Hampshire and Vermont.
Go ahead, Karen, sorry.
Hi, everybody. My name is Karen. My favorite local amphibian, I think, would be the wood frog, especially as we're getting more into the autumn and heading towards winter. They're really cool because they can create an antifreeze-like substance in their blood, so they can stay frozen underneath the water and the mud all winter long, and then they reemerge when the spring comes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus. My pronouns are he, him, his. And my favorite amphibian from the Northeast would have to be the American bullfrog. They're found around here, but they're also found in other parts of the United States and even other parts of the world where they're invasive species, and they will eat pretty much anything that they can catch and that they are larger than. Fascinating animal.
Great, thank you all. So to start off, I want to ask the question of what is an amphibian?
I'll take that one. That's an excellent question. What makes an animal an amphibian? And there are a few defining characteristics that they have. For one, they have a backbone. So we have a backbone, and so do all amphibians. Another really cool thing about amphibians is that they actually have 4 ways of getting oxygen into their body. They can breathe through their skin. They can breathe through their lungs when most of them are adults. When they are tadpoles, they actually have gills to breathe through. And the last way that they breathe is actually by pumping their throat back and forth. If you look at the photo right behind me, you might see in frogs that this part of the mouth, there we go, this part of the mouth moves back and forth, and they're actually pumping oxygen through their nostrils, and they can actually get that oxygen through the lining of their throat. They are ectothermic, which means they're cold-blooded and they rely on the outside environment to warm their bodies. And another really cool aspect of amphibians is that they have multiple life stages. You may have heard that frogs go through metamorphosis. They start out as an egg, they hatch into a tadpole, they start to grow arms and legs, and they start losing their tail, and then they are a full-grown adult. That looks completely different from that first tadpole. So I believe those are the characteristics that make an animal an amphibian.
I'll just also add the skin. So Marcus said how they can breathe through their skin, and that's accomplished by not having scales or hair or feathers or anything growing out of it. It's very permeable. That's a fun word to say.
Great. So we have one question from Zachary, age 7. Why are frogs so slimy?
It's a great question, and it actually has to do mostly with their skin. And truth be told, I'll just lay it out there, not all frogs are slimy. Typically toads, which are kind of a subgroup of frog, tend to have much more drier and bumpy skin. But the reason why many frogs have that slime is to keep their skin protected. It also means that if you're out searching for tadpoles and frogs and salamanders in your local ponds and streams, it's really important to just look at them from afar. The moment we pick them up with our hands, we have a lot of oils that come out of our skin, and that can actually block some of that ability for them to breathe and drink right through their skin. So it's best to either make sure you have protective gloves on if you're going to scoop them up, but also it's probably just smart to leave them where they are. So that slime helps keep the water inside of the frog's body.
Great. So speaking of skin, why are some amphibians really bright colors? Does that help them? Why do they have that?
Could be for a lot of different reasons. Some of the ones that come to mind are some of the poison dart frogs that live in South America. They can be extremely vivid blue or red or yellow, And that kind of acts as a warning sign to predators that might be thinking of eating that frog that they should stay away, because that poison dart frog actually is coated in a poison that's extremely powerful. It's powerful enough that it could kill 2 full-grown elephants, one tiny little 2-inch frog. So in that case, the bright color means I'm a dangerous poison dart frog. Don't even try to eat me. You'll get really sick. You should just stay away.
There's also a frog that has bright red eyes, and they use that as a startle technique. So if something is coming near them, they'll open up their eyes real big, and they'll just have these red eyeballs pointing out towards the predator that will likely scare that predator away.
Great, and building on that, Max asks, why are some frogs toxic?
So just to build on what Eric said, some of them have toxins to protect themselves from predators, and they sometimes pair their toxic skin or the toxins in their body with bright colors so that predators don't even have to eat them to know that they are dangerous to eat. But what's fascinating is that, especially with the poison dart frogs that Eric was mentioning, they get their poison from their diet. They eat certain insects that give them the nutrients and sometimes the direct poisons that can actually help them defend themselves. So that's to say that poison dart frogs in captivity that don't get the same diet as they do in the wild won't be poisonous. They will still have those very bright colors, but they just won't have those toxins. Now, that's not the case with all frogs. Some frogs and toads produce their own toxins, like the cane toad comes to mind. Regardless of what that toad eats, it will be able to produce poison for predators. As long as it eats something, it will be able to produce some sort of poison.
And one of my favorite stories about the cane toad is the co-evolution with birds. So birds have learned that they're poisonous and they can't eat them, but birds have also learned that if you flip them upside down and just eat the belly parts of the toad, that they don't get the toxin and they don't die. So it's a really interesting back and forth sort of arms race out there in nature.
All right, so Kayla and Danny want to know, what is the difference between a toad and a frog?
So I always like to phrase it this way. Work with me, it's going to sound confusing. All toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. Same thing as all tortoises are turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. Or for us non-biologists in the group, all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. So to put it a little more bluntly, toads are just a subgroup of frogs. So they have lots and lots in common. Some of the minor differences, as I mentioned briefly before, is that toads tend to live in drier environments. So frogs, sort of that overarching group like a bullfrog we mentioned, or the poison dart frogs, tend to live either in water or in very humid environments. So their body constantly has access to the water, where toads, like say the American toad, that's one of our local ones here, they're really lumpy bumpy, they're only a couple inches across, but you tend to find them living more on the forest floor rather than directly in a pond or a river. So they can tolerate those drier temperatures a little bit better. That's the big difference. Can either of you think of another big difference between toads and frogs?
Not really. There tends to be exceptions to both sides.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll find frogs that are a little bumpier, they don't have smooth skin, and sometimes you'll find toads that have smoother skins. So it's really up to a lot of biologists to really determine the relationship between certain animals. But we make these generalizations to help us just at a glance try to tell the difference.
Gwendolyn, age 9, wants to know, are turtles amphibians?
So turtles are not amphibians. They're in the group of reptiles, which is really close to amphibians, kind of gets confused with them sometimes. The main groups of animals are birds, mammals, fish. Don't really confuse too many of them too often. And then reptiles and amphibians, pretty close. They're both ectothermic, like Marcus mentioned. They have to rely on their environment to generate their body heat. And they have similar kind of outsides to their bodies, with amphibians having that skin and reptiles having scales that can kind of seem similar sometimes. But the main difference is that reptiles lay their eggs on land and they start their life on the land. Amphibians lay their eggs in the water and they start their life in the water, and it's in a completely different form than their adult form. So a frog hatches from an egg in the water and becomes a tadpole. It starts out its life as a tadpole with gills. It breathes the water, and then it changes what we call a metamorphosis into a frog. A snake, which is a reptile, or a turtle or a tortoise, hatches on the land and is just a smaller version of its adult final form. So that's the main difference, where they lay their eggs and how they start their life.
So speaking of which, someone is asking, do frogs live anywhere inland? Maybe we could talk about where amphibians do like to live.
An excellent question. I like that you phrased it as inland, because truth be told, if we're talking about inland versus coastal, you don't find that many amphibians living right near the coast, mainly because based on that bare skin that they have, they don't typically survive well in salt water. So there are some, like Marcus mentioned, the cane toad, also known as the marine toad, and they kind of got that nickname because they live in the rainforests right near the beaches, right near the ocean. But in fact, amphibians really rely on freshwater sources. So anywhere, even if you just have what's called a vernal pool, so during the spring, it might fill with the snow melt or the heavy rains in the spring, and then by this point in the summer, they're all dried up. So that's an excellent place to find certain types of amphibians around this area. Salamanders really rely on those. They'll lay their eggs in the spring in the nice vernal pool. And by the time those tiny little tadpoles have grown into their final stage as an adult, they don't need the water anymore and they can go about their business. And then the next spring, they'll lay their eggs in the water again when the pool fills back up. So you can find amphibians not just in pools of water, but there are certain species that live up in tall trees and they find little pockets of water in cups of like flowers or leaves or something called pitcher plants that are elsewhere, mostly in other parts of the world. I would beg to say that amphibians as a group are some of the most diverse of all the vertebrates, of all the backboned animals. Marcus mentioned briefly there are exceptions to every rule. I would say there's almost more exceptions in the amphibian group than there are normals. There's some real fascinating ways that amphibians reproduce and grow and change. I highly recommend studying them.
Great. So Lydia, age 4.5, wants to know, how do frogs get their name, or maybe amphibians in general?
So I'll start that one. I don't know how specifically we named frogs, but I do know where the name amphibian comes from. It's actually from two words in Greek, amphi and bios. Amphi means both or two, and bio means life. And so if you put those together, you might get amphibios or amphibian. And the reason for that is it's called both lives or two life because, like Eric mentioned, they start their life out in water. And then as they grow older, many amphibians, not all of them, but many of them spend more time on land. So if you think of life on land and on water, those two environments, they live on both of those. So that's where you get amphibians or amphibios.
Great. Tyler, age 7, wants to know, what is the world's largest amphibian and how big is it?
You want to take that one again, Marcus?
Oh, I would love to.
Yeah, you're excited for it.
The world's largest amphibian today is the South China giant salamander. Unfortunately, they are extremely rare. And so the specimen, the largest one ever recorded, was back in like the 1930s, the 1920s, very, very long ago. But this salamander was about 5 feet and 9 inches, almost 6 feet long. And they can weigh close to 100 pounds. And so that is huge. It's like completely blows out all of the other amphibians out of the water simply due to its sheer size. Now, there has been a lot of other giant salamander discoveries since then, but they don't tend to get that size. That one was really, really rare. But that's the largest salamander. There is a very large frog called the Goliath frog, and that's the size of a very large dinner plate. And amphibians typically don't get that large, and part of the reason is because they tend to be sensitive animals. Because they can breathe through their skin, they're very sensitive to changes in the environment. And if you're large, chances are it's hard to find an environment that really suits your needs and might change rapidly that you might not be able to adapt to.
Great. And Anna, age 8, asks, what is the smallest amphibian?
Karen, go for it.
All right. The smallest one that has been discovered, because keep in mind, scientists and humans in general are always discovering new species, but it is a teeny tiny little frog. It doesn't even have a common name, and I can't ramble off the Latin name off the top of my head, but it is so tiny, it fits very easily right in the center of a quarter. So I don't know, like a quarter of an inch maybe. Incredibly, incredibly tiny, and that's at its full grown size. There are a lot of those either larval stages, so the tadpole or other larvae, that as they metamorphose, they are very teeny tiny, but they quickly grow to their full size, adult size. Even cane toads and Goliath toads, they still start pretty small when they metamorphose.
Maddie, age 5, wants to know what frogs eat, or maybe what amphibians like to eat.
So it depends on the kind of frog. A lot of them eat lots of different things. The frog that I work with at the Museum of Science is called the African bullfrog. It's the second biggest frog there is. It's about half the size of that Goliath frog. So about the size of both your hands put out. Imagine that entirely full of frog. And they eat anything they can fit inside of their mouth. So they eat lots of insects, like lots and lots of other frogs. A main part of their diet is insects. They also just eat kind of anything else that happens to wander by its huge mouth. So they'll eat smaller frogs, other amphibians, even mammals. So imagine a frog big enough to eat a mouse. But most of the time, I would say most amphibians probably dine on insects and other small animals like that.
I think in general, most adult amphibians are carnivorous, meaning they feed only on meat, including insects. But a lot of their larval phases, so those tadpoles, when they're in the water, they do feed a lot on vegetation and algae and stuff in the water. So it's interesting that they really do have those two lives.
So speaking of tadpoles, do every amphibian have a tadpole stage?
Oh, I have trouble using every, always, never. I would say for the most part, they all have some sort of larval phase. So larva is the word we use more generally. So tadpoles are pretty specific to frogs and toads. When we're talking about baby salamanders, before they go through that metamorphosis, they're just called larvae. I don't know of an example of an amphibian that comes out of its egg in its adult shape with lungs. So I think they all have a larval form, but I'm always hesitant to use the word all.
Yeah, there is a salamander that's from Mexico called the axolotl, and that one goes through its larval phase and then doesn't really transition into its full adult phase. It kind of stays in that limbo phase and has amazing properties in that phase. One of them is that it can regenerate its tissues, including entire lost limbs. So an axolotl can lose a limb, grow it back so well that researchers can't even tell which limb is the one that was lost. And so that one doesn't fully go on to metamorphose into its adult form in most cases, but it's really, really rare. It lives in just one lake in Mexico.
Kind of to work off what Karen was saying, how there's always exceptions to the rules. I still can't think of any amphibian that doesn't have a larval stage, but I do know one that gets a lot of care when it's in the egg and when it's a tadpole, but emerges as essentially a small adult. And that would be everyone's favorite toad, the Suriname toad. This is a special toad that lays its eggs, and then those eggs actually hatch in the mother's back. And it's not the most fun thing to watch, but when those eggs emerge and those babies emerge, they're actually just smaller Suriname toads. You can see all of the limbs that they have. So they don't look like a small tadpole hatching from the egg. They actually look like a miniature toad. So I think for me, that would be the closest approximation to missing out on a larval stage, because they're not really in that tadpole phase trying to survive, as is the case with nearly all other amphibians. If you want to watch a video, do so at your own risk. It is not a pleasant video to watch.
And they used to have an exhibit at the New England Aquarium with Suriname toads. It's been a couple years since I've been there, but certainly if you're visiting, keep an eye out for them.
All right, I don't know if we know the answer to this question, but how many species of amphibians are there?
Thousands.
Maybe you can list some of them that we do know.
So I know last I checked, there's about 8,000 species, but we're constantly discovering new species, and we're constantly looking at old species and deciding that some populations are different from others and that they're in fact two different species. But as of now, there are about 8,000. And what's fascinating is about 90% of them are frog species. And there are multiple kinds of amphibians. We've talked about frogs, toads, there are salamanders, there are newts, and there is a fifth group called caecilians. And caecilians are some very weird amphibians because they look more like big worms or very slimy snakes than amphibians. Many of them don't have any arms or legs, or if they do, they're very tiny, and they spend a lot of their time underground. But they do fit the criteria of being an amphibian. They have multiple ways of breathing. They breathe through their skin. And so we do categorize them as amphibians, but we don't know of that many because they're kind of hard to find. So there are many amphibian species out there. It's just a matter of us and maybe eventually you discovering them.
Great. So are there any conservation efforts around amphibian species?
There definitely are. We mentioned that frogs are some of the most diverse species, and right now there is kind of a massive worldwide problem with a fungus that is causing a lot of frog species to start to die off in large numbers. And so there's scientists working around the world to try to figure out what we can do to try to stop the spread of this one specific fungus, how to prevent it from affecting areas where it already is. And that's just one example of ways that we're trying to figure out how to protect all these species. We use the term indicator for amphibians because they can indicate how healthy an ecosystem is, because they're one of the first affected by any changes in that ecosystem. So for example, if a river becomes polluted, the toxins in the river will be absorbed by the skin of the frogs and salamanders there, and they'll see effects first. So their population will start to decline before we see effects in the birds and mammals and other kinds of animals. And so we want to make sure that they stay safe, and they also can tell us whether a whole environment is safe.
Great. So I think for our last question, we want to know what your favorite amphibian is, or maybe if there's an amphibian that has a really unique trait or skill that you'd like to share.
Always tricky picking a favorite, but I really like those axolotls that Eric mentioned, mainly for the fact that, most salamanders have the ability to regrow their legs. Axolotls are a little more unique in the fact that in laboratory settings, at least, they're used a lot in research because they're really strange. We have been able to notice that not only do they regrow limbs, but they can regrow parts of their spinal cord and parts of their brain. So scientists are studying really hard, trying to figure out what are those mechanisms, and is this something that if we could figure out how the axolotl is getting down to those root stem cells and regrowing a limb, is there any way that we could figure out how to replicate that in a human? So they're fascinating animals. Certainly, if you've never heard of them, look them up. Axolotls, AXOLATL.
OTL.
OTL. Yeah.
We
so
just
it's
did
a real weird word.
We just did an episode of our podcast called Pulsar, which you can find on our website, talking to a scientist who works with axolotls every day. So you can find that conversation about what kind of science they're doing, what kind of things they're hoping to learn. We already mentioned so many different kinds of amphibians. I think my favorite is probably the African bullfrog because I do work with them. And one thing I didn't get to mention is that they estivate, which is a little bit like hibernation that a bear does, kind of going into that suspended animation to make it through a prolonged period of cold. What the African bullfrog does is go through a prolonged period of dryness in the African savanna by burrowing underground and estivating, meaning shedding its outer layers of skin to lock in all the moisture and staying like that for weeks or maybe months of the dry season, and only emerging from that when the rainy season makes nice puddles and muddy areas. It can crawl back up and find some food, and they can reproduce. And then once all those puddles dry back up, they burrow back under the ground and they estivate again.
My favorite amphibian or amphibian that I really, really like would be the rough-skinned newt. And this is a newt that can be found in Western United States in some really wet forests. And what's really cool is that this newt is extremely poisonous. It's really toxic. So toxic that most very large animals in the area would pass or die from eating this small newt. And the reason that they're so poisonous is not to prevent like a bear or a wolf from eating them, but just to prevent small snakes from eating them. So what's happened over time is that these newts have developed a toxin in their skin, and a snake has developed a resistance to this toxin. And so the snake will eat the newts, and then over the course of time, the newts might evolve stronger toxins, or at least the newts with stronger toxins tend to survive more. And then the same thing happens with the snakes. The snakes with a stronger resistance to that specific poison tend to survive. And so you have this kind of evolutionary arms race happening between two species. You have a species of snake that is incredibly resistant to a very, very specific form of toxin that wouldn't really help it in any other condition other than to eat the rough-skinned newt. And you have this species of newt that's just extremely poisonous to the point where it's kind of ridiculous how poisonous it is just to stay away or try to stay away from that one species of snake.
Awesome. And Sarah, I have one last thing before we wrap up. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment because I need to thank Marcus. For those of you who are watching, many of you have probably seen Marcus a bunch in our MOS Live programs. He was part of a one-year fellowship. So unfortunately, come Monday, Marcus's time for now at the museum is complete as he moves on to other endeavors. But he has been an absolutely amazing live presentations fellow. He's had things thrown at him this year that none of us could have expected. And I just want everyone in your own homes, give a nice cheer for Marcus and the amazing work that he has done. And hopefully someday we'll see him back at the Museum of Science. So thank you, Marcus. We appreciate everything that you've done.
Thank you so much. Not expecting that.
I knew that I would make him blush.
Just a little bit.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for everything. Unfortunately, we're out of time today, though, so wave goodbye to everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, everyone, for having great questions today. And if you would like to watch more of our programs, you can head to www.mos.org/mos@home. And if you like today's program and would like to support the museum, you can go to engage.mos.org/welcome. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and everyone give a sound of applause for Marcus.